All right. Well, good evening. It's good to be back together again. Continue to pray for those things we've made mention of. Especially be praying for Brother Nathaniel Hilly with the situations that he's going through. Pray for his wife and his kids and the rest of his family and the church that he pastors as they are there by his side waiting. It's never fun to be waiting, but I know the Lord can be with them. The Lord can give grace and peace, and we're thankful to know that He does. Be sure and be praying for them faithfully. All right. Well, we actually started a lesson in Psalms here a couple Sundays ago, and we went over Psalms chapter 1, and then last week we went over Psalms chapter 2. Today, though, we're going to talk about a time of trouble and a time of trial. I want to put yourself, try to put yourself in a place before we read some of these verses. Have you ever been in a place where you're actually doing pretty good? Things are going well. Your family's doing good. Your business stuff is going well. You're healthy. Things look pretty good. And then somebody very, very close to you turns out to not be what you thought they were. That person is now actively working against you. Somebody you deeply loved has betrayed you, has tried to take things away from you. Not only that, but a host of people that you thought looked up to you and admired you and wanted the best for you are now following this person that you loved who has totally betrayed you. And not only that, but the person standing by their side, helping them betray you, is one of your closest people that you have confided in. You have spent many hours with this person, talking through problems and struggles and working together to kind of try to find solutions, try to work through the things that bother you and work through the challenges that confront you. And this person has provided you great advice and been a shoulder to cry on and really just meant so much to you. But now you find out that that person is actually the one that has been helping and in many ways orchestrating your betrayal. And you also find at this time that all those people that didn't like you to begin with, but that had been quieted by the fact that those around you cared about you and watched out for you and took care of you, they were quieted by that. But now, just like the buzzards, when they see the thing dying in the wilderness, they start to circle. And they start to pick at you. And now you find that those people that have hated you the whole time, they get to be where they're very vocal again. And now they're making claims against you and they're saying horrible, hateful things about you. And it's bad. It's really bad. Now listen, I don't know whether or not you have ever been in that kind of place before. Maybe not to that scale, but listen, I think we've probably all been in places where somebody we trusted wasn't what they turned out to be something else. And we've been in those situations where when things start to look bad, Maybe our friends are distancing themselves a little bit. And our enemies are drawing closer. And people are starting to say things about us. I don't know to what scale you've experienced that. But listen, in the midst of all that, God can provide peace that we, honestly, when we look at what we're faced with, we don't see how we can have peace. Listen, it doesn't mean that in the midst of that, you're not going to be burdened. It doesn't mean in the midst of that, you're not going to spend many hours on your knees before God in prayer, asking Him to help, asking Him to change things. Listen, Him giving you peace doesn't mean necessarily that all those problems go away, and it doesn't mean that they don't still burden you and that you don't still pray about them. But it means that you can stand in the face of those things and serve Him anyways. And He will give you the strength to do it. Sometimes we look at what's going in our life and we think, man, we've got it bad. This is just horrible. You know, sometimes when you get to feeling that way, open up and read a little bit about what happened to Job. Read about what happened to David. Read about what happened to the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter and James and John. And listen, there are people that have been great, shining examples of how to serve God in the face of trials and troubles. And if we're honest with ourselves, they have suffered more than we have in a lifetime. They suffered many times in a matter of a few years. But yet, despite all of that, they kept going. They kept serving Him. They kept worshiping Him. And listen, this example that I really, really wanted you to take a little bit of time this morning and try to put yourself in these shoes, okay? Seriously. For you to understand the passage that we're about to read, you seriously need to try to think about how you would be feeling if one of your loved ones was now your enemy. Not only the loved one is your enemy, but the person that used to counsel you and help you through those problems is now the one orchestrating this one that's betrayed you, is orchestrating their success. And that all of the people that admired you have turned their back on you. And all of your enemies are now shouting from the hilltops how horrible you are. I mean, how would you feel? I don't know about you. Man, I would probably be feeling a whole host of emotions. Bitterness, anger, sorrow, grief, resentment. I'd be tired. I'd just be tired. I tell you what, stuff like that just takes it out of you. It just zaps your strength, zaps your energy. I mean, it wears you down. I'd be confused. How could this happen? It'd be a roller coaster. 1 minute burning with anger and passion over what's happened. Another moment down in the dumps, depressed, blaming yourself maybe. I mean, you imagine the ranges of emotions if you're faced with something like that. I want you to turn to Psalms chapter 3, and I want you to read not the first verse, but the superscription above this. It says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. What I just described is exactly what happened to David. The one who came in and took over the kingdom was his own son. By the way, not an estranged son, although there was some weird things between David and Absalom. But listen, if you read David and what he had to say about Absalom, this is a man who loved his son. He may not have always done right by Absalom, but he loved Absalom. And Absalom was if you read about Absalom, you come away with the idea that Absalom was kind of charismatic kind of guy. People liked him. Man, he would stand and talk to David and others, probably sounding all great and on this side. All the while, he's over here stirring up people, winning the hearts of people that loved David, winning their hearts. And there's a guy who was David's counselor. His closest counselor, the Bible seems to indicate. And yet this man intentionally went and helped Absalom, became Absalom's counselor. Listen, this was a man who was brilliant when it came to strategy. This was a man that when David found out that this guy was Absalom's counselor, he had one course of action. And that course of action was to cry out to God that God would cause his counsel to come to naught. This guy was brilliant. David knew that the only way to beat this guy was if God intervened. We also find in places where David talked about that this was a guy that he had spent many a night with, that they had stayed up late dealing with challenges and problems, and David had, you almost get the idea that David had bore his heart to him. But that's the guy who was standing by Absalom's side. We also learn, as we would have read through this, that these guys that didn't like David, when David was having to flee the city, there's a guy that's cursing him from the hilltops and yelling at him and saying wicked, evil things about him. People turned their backs on David. Listen, did David, through the middle of this, did David have some faithful friends? He did. He had some that were going to take the Ark of the Covenant out of Jerusalem and take it with David. And David said, no, you take that thing back. He had a counselor that was going to come with him, and David said, no, the best you can do is go back and you try to be the other voice that Absalom hears. So yes, even in the midst of this, David still had faithful friends. But listen, that didn't change the fact that his own beloved son was trying to kill him. Caused him to have to leave his palace. His own son took David's concubines and defiled them in front of the nation. This was a time of great despair for David. Honestly, Absalom had done such a good job. You imagine the current reigning king is so caught off guard, and there's so many people on Absalom's side, David's only choice is to abandon the city. I mean, these are dark, dark days. But did you know that it's in that time that we're told that this psalm came from that time? A psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. So let's just read this in that context that we just talked about. Lord. Now anytime you see those all caps like that, that means Jehovah. This is the self-existent one. This is Yahweh. This is the God of heaven. He says, Jehovah, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Listen, you can't hardly have a more true statement than that right there. His own son, his own counselor, the people of his own nation, many of them. Many are they that rise up against me. David understood what it meant to be betrayed. David understood what it meant to look like you're going to lose everything because of those you thought were close to you. It says in verse 2, many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. You understand what David is saying here? David is saying, the people think I've been defeated. Not just defeated, but abandoned by God. Listen, this is a man who the Bible declares is a man after God's own heart. The people knew that he had a close relationship with God. The people knew that he tried to faithfully serve God. David was known for this. But at this time in his life, do you know what David said? The people are saying God will not help him. The people are saying God has abandoned David. God has forsaken David. God will not stoop down and help David. This is where you really start to see the vultures coming in and the wolves closing in on those that they view as weak. Hey, God has finally abandoned David. Now is our time to strike. You understand why he says that there are many that are risen up against me, and how that they are increased that trouble me. David has always had trouble. Listen, you look at about any time in David's life, David was almost always fighting something or someone, right? But he says, they are greatly increased that trouble me. David was one that understood, hey, look, in the common course of life, there's problems, there's trials, there's troubles. But right now, it's overwhelming me. And then verse 3 starts out with these amazing words. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me. You know, there's different thoughts and opinions here, and it doesn't specifically tell us for sure. I happen to believe, and I could be wrong, I happen to believe that David probably wrote these words before all of the turmoil was over. Maybe not. It might have been afterwards. But the superscription does say when he fled from Absalom his son. You understand that also, no doubt, whether he wrote the psalm afterwards or during, listen, there is no doubt that some of these words of David were uttered in the middle of this storm. Man, great trouble. People have thinking God has forsaken him. Listen, even though everybody around you thinks that God has forsaken you, that doesn't mean a thing. David knew, no matter what everybody else was saying, no matter what they declared, no matter how much they shouted from the hilltops that God has forsaken David, David knew his shield was Jehovah. But thou, O Lord, that's that same capitalized Lord right there. O Jehovah, thou art a shield for me. You are my protection. You know what David knew? David knew that despite Absalom, and despite his counselor, and despite the people, David knew that if God stood by him, there was protection. It didn't matter how many people turned against him. If God was by his side, he had a shield. He also knew that if he was going to be restored, it had to come from God. He says, "But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head." Listen, my glory and the lifter up of mine head. He knew that his strength and his ability didn't come from himself. He knew that it was Jehovah that could lift him up. He knew that his glory as king and his kingdom and everything he had came from God. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me and my glory. David didn't say, "This can't happen to me. I am the most glorious king this nation will ever have." He said, "My glory comes from you, Jehovah. My glory comes from you. And you are the one that lifts my head up." Listen, I don't know whether or not David is just talking here about restoring him to the kingdom. I actually don't know that that's what he's saying. You are the lifter up of mine head. Listen, if your head is going to be bowed under trials and troubles, this is a pretty good situation for your head to be hanging pretty low. But he says, "Man, Jehovah, you're my shield." It wasn't Absalom. It wasn't even your people. My shield is you. My glory is you. You're the one that can take me when my head is hanging low and lift it up. Verse 4 actually tells us what David did at this time. He says, "I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill." David says, listen, it was bad. Everybody seemed to be against me. Everybody was declaring, God has forsaken him. But I know that you're my shield. I know my glory comes from you. I know that you alone can lift up my head. And in that moment, what I did was I cried out to you. I cried out to you. I lifted up my voice, and he heard me. You know, whether or not David got instant results, or whether or not the Lord just gave him the peace of knowing that I heard you. The problem of Absalom didn't go away instantly. Matter of fact, the problem wasn't even resolved the way David wanted it to be resolved. Absalom ended up getting his hair caught in the branches, and Joab came along and killed him, despite David's wishes that that not happen. But when David fell on his knees and cried out to the Lord, he knew the Lord heard him. Listen, verse 5, you know how I know that? Because verse 5 says what happens after he cried out. Verse 5 says, I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. Listen, if you've ever been in one of those situations where life is bad and you don't know which way to go, and it's just, it's overwhelming. You understand that at times like that, listen, you can't just go into your room and lay down in your bed and fall off in peaceful rest. Man, especially in this time, not only did he have all these things assailing his mind and what's going to happen and why did this happen and all of these emotions, but listen, he was in mortal danger. At any minute, he could be found. You understand that when he was fleeing from Absalom, to the best of his knowledge, they were coming. They were pursuing. They were wanting to find him. And yet we find that David says in verse 5, I laid me down and slept. In the midst of all that, when David remembered that the Lord was his shield, his glory, the one that could lift his head up, and that the Lord heard his prayer, David said, I was able to lay down and sleep. And not only was I able to lay down and sleep, but I didn't die in the middle of the night. I woke up and the Lord had sustained me. The Lord had protected me. The Lord had blessed me and caused me to be able to rest. He says in verse 6, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Listen, I don't know the number of people that had turned. It's likely that it was at least 10,000 people. Listen, there was an army following Absalom. Some of the people were following Absalom. But David is able to say, listen, when I remembered who my shield was, and I remembered who lifted up my head, when I remembered that he heard my cry, and when he gave me the peace in the middle of this to be able to lay down and to be able to get some rest and to wake up and be sustained, man, the confidence and the trust and the courage filled David, and he said, I will not fear 10,000 people that have set themselves round about me. In verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. Wait a second. He's already knew God was a shield. He's already prayed. He's found peace. He's found rest. Now he's found confidence. And yet his words are still this, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. He knows where his deliverance comes from. He knows where his strength is coming from. Do you? Do we? In the midst of our troubles and our trials, when we cry out to God, do we have that confidence that he hears us? Do we remember the times that he has already been our shield, that he's already delivered us, that he's already lifted up our head? Listen, if we are serving him and we are following him, he has promised to never forsake us. It doesn't matter what trouble you have, he can overcome it. Listen, there is absolutely trouble that you can't overcome. I'm not going to lie to you. There is troubles that are too much for you. But there is no trouble that's too much for him. This is what David realizes in Psalms chapter 3. He says, for thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. He says, listen, whether he's talking about after the fact, and he knows what happens to Absalom and his enemies, or whether he's remembering the times before, he knows that God is the one that's able to destroy his enemies. Thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Listen, David, I believe that when you look back, David is looking back on his life and he's thinking about the times that he beat the Philistines. He's thinking about the times that he was able to get through past Saul and all of the things that happened with him and Saul. He's thinking about the times when he was fighting this country or that country, or there was these enemies. Listen, David had a deep well to draw from to say, I know where my deliverance comes from. David knew there were many times in his life that he should not have been able to make it through what he made it through, but God delivered him. And he says in verse 8, and this is how we are going to end this psalm, salvation belongeth unto the Lord. You talk about a totally different mindset. Or maybe even mindset's not the right word. But what a difference the ending of this psalm has from the beginning. The beginning is a cry out of how they've increased that trouble me, and many are they that rise up against me. And everyone is saying, you have forsaken me. And honestly, from a worldly perspective, it really had to look like that. Listen, there will be times in your life where you feel like God is being silent. There are. There are. I've experienced them. But He hasn't forsaken you. There's times when He just wants to hear you cry out to Him. There are times He needs you to realize where your strength comes from. Because honestly, sometimes our nature is to start to chalk all those wins up to ourselves. I also understand that some of what David is going through is because of his own sin. David didn't handle some things correctly when it involved Absalom. But David knew that God was his deliverer. David knew that in the darkest storm, in the worst scenario that he could think about, it was God that could provide salvation and deliverance. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Listen, I'm going to ask you a question. Lots of times when we think about thy people, the Lord's people, we think about the nation of Israel. Was Absalom an Israelite? Was David's counselor an Israelite? Was the people that were rising up with Absalom against David Israelites? They were, actually. But David says, listen, thy blessing is upon thy people. Thy blessing is upon thy people. The people that stay faithful and true to the Lord, the people of God, He will not forsake. David had his problems. He was a man. He was not perfect. But David did love God. And David did try to follow God. And in his time of trouble and trial, David remembered where his strength came from. And he knew that if he was going to be delivered, it was God that was going to do it. And this psalm should actually be a great encouragement to us. Because when it seems like we have no idea what's going to happen next, when it seems like the closest to us have betrayed us, God is able to come in when we cry out to Him. When we draw close to Him, God is able to come in and say, I'm here. I'll never forsake you. I'll never leave you. And as God brings that peace, and then something as simple as giving us that time of rest, and I can lay down on my bed in the midst of this storm, and the Lord has provided rest for me. He builds on that with confidence. He reminds us of the things that He's done for us already. And we walk away from this going, I know where my salvation is. My salvation is of you, and only you. We're going to close by rereading verse 3, 4, and 5. And we'll just read these and we'll close. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and He heard me out of His holy hill, Selah. I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. Brother Philip, would you come and lead us in a song, please?